We're going to look at a part of the course that a lot of people are not particularly keen on, but it's interesting, and it's certainly something that you could be asked questions on, and that is the origins of psychology. So where did psychology come from? What is its history, and how did it become the subject that we know and love today? So we're going to have a little look at that and some of the possible questions you might be asked. Okay, so we're looking at the work of Wilhelm Wundt back in 1879. So Wilhelm Wundt can be seen as being the pioneer of modern psychology. He took it into the modern age. Obviously, particularly interested in scientific inquiry, or he wouldn't have seen it that way, I guess. But that's what it's become since. So he established the first psychology lab. All right, and he was looking at human consciousness. Now, human consciousness, not easy to say, is something that we've only really started again to study in the last maybe 20 years or so. Before that, or between the times of Wilhelm Wundt and 20 years ago, consciousness was seen as being something that was far too difficult to really study. So he set himself a difficult goal there, and what he wanted to do was to study human consciousness in a controlled and scientific manner. Okay, and he pioneered this. What wouldn't be seen by us today to be particularly scientific, but it was a method which was certainly a big improvement on what had been before, which was called introspection. Okay, so introspection, what is it? Well, it's simply asking people to consider what is happening in particular situations. So to take what's going on the inside, so people's thoughts and feelings, and to bring them out, if you will, to discuss them, or to say what's going on in that situation. So trying to get some sort of cause and effect relationships, and trying to link outward behaviors with internal thought processes. So that's introspection. And what introspection did was it helped to break up what he thought was the separate components of consciousness. So trying to sort of, instead of seeing consciousness as this big amorphous blob of a thing, trying to actually break it up into its different parts, right? And he called the approach structuralism. Okay, so what he's basically talking about there is the fact that the consciousness is divided into particular structures which can be looked at individually. And what he did really well was, as part of this introspection method, he used standardized procedures. Now, standardized procedures are things which are common now, aren't they, in terms of experiments? Because without standardized procedures, we can't replicate experiments. We can't really get any idea of cause and effect, because it could be due to all manner of other extraneous or even confounding variables. So, yeah, he produced experiments or introspection studies which could be replicated. And the sort of things he did was, he would ask someone to report on their experience of a particular event. Okay, so one of the ones that's quite well known is the watching a ticking metronome and saying, what was that like? What were your thoughts? What were your feelings at that time? So that's essentially introspection. And we have Wilhelm Wundt to. So Wilhelm Wundt is pretty easy, isn't it, to look at that and say, well, that's very simplistic, isn't it? But we've got to understand that he was operating in the late 19th century there, in a completely new world, really, with regards to looking at human experience, and as such we can consider him to be a forerunner to later scientific approaches. So that's a positive for introspection and the work of Wundt in particular. He was a forerunner, he was a pioneer, he was someone who, as a consequence of his work, a lot of the scientific research that we understand now has come about. So kudos to Wilhelm. He could only record, however, subjective experience, so there's a massive lack of objectivity in this, isn't there? So one person's experience of a ticking metronome could be very different to another. Now, that could be a bad thing, or it could be a bad thing. It could be a bad thing, or it could be a good thing, because there are obviously parts of psychology that are still interested in subjective experience, aren't there? So for instance, the humanistic approach takes an idiographic approach to its studies. It's only interested in case studies and subjective experience because it says that there's no point having large-scale general rules that apply to everybody because they don't. So whether you consider that to be a limitation or not is another matter, really. But in terms of pure modern scientific inquiry, yes, it would be the fact that it's subjective. This is the sort of question you might get, and I know we've looked at this one before, but it certainly bears repeating. This is an application question looking at Millie doing a class presentation on introspection. Okay, so as part of her presentation, she said introspection is thinking about our own thoughts. Okay, and after the presentation, her classmates said they had learned very little about introspection. That's some brutal peer review, I would say there. Anyway, explain what else Millie could have said about the major features of introspection so that her classmates would be better informed. Right, so it's an application to a context that you're unfamiliar with, but essentially it's just asking you to say what introspection is, so what are the major features of it. It's got 4 marks there, and the fact that it's talking about explaining would mean that you're not just going to be listing down parts of it, you're going to be saying, why those bits are important, etc. So let's have a look at what we've said. Okay, so some of the factors that you might well have included in your answer could have been things like the focus on being objective, whether it satisfies that or not is another matter. Reflection on sensations, feelings and images. Okay, so remember introspection was all about being able to talk about what it was like to experience a particular thing, whether that be a ticking metronome or whatever. Wundt would ask people to focus on an everyday object and notice sensations, so you're going on to explain a little bit further about it. Breaking down into separate elements. Okay, so that's that systematic structuralist approach, systematic reporting of an experience, and then given specific examples. So essentially what you're doing is you're just giving a much more a richer description than what Millie did, really, talking about what introspection is and what it would look like, and maybe giving some examples there. I'd say a pretty straightforward 4 marks there, really. Okay, so within this area, we also talked about the emergence of psychology as a science. So taking up the baton, really, from Wilhelm Wundt was John B. Watson. Now, John Watson we know, don't we, because we've studied a little bit of his work when we looked at little Albert, Watson and Rayner, and we know that Watson is a behaviourist because behaviourism came next, didn't it, in the kind of the history of psychology. It went from introspection to behaviourism, with a little bit of psychodynamic kind of getting in there as well, I suppose. And anyway, Watson was not a big fan of introspection. He didn't see it as a valid research method. And again, we probably all agree because of its subjectivity. Too subjective, he would say. Humanists might argue against that, but that's what Watson said. And so as a behaviourist, he argued that only observable behaviour, behaviour which you could actually see and measure, is actually worth being studied. Therefore, as I mentioned before, the whole sort of concept of human consciousness went out the window for an awful long time, because that doesn't produce behaviours which you can very easily measure, very easily see. Behaviourists, obviously, they took over the world of psychology, didn't they? And they introduced, or John B. Watson and his fellow behaviourists introduced the controlled lab experiment. The controlled lab experiment, I suppose, is the gold standard, isn't it? Really, it's the most objective and controlled environment that we can possibly have, so we can have the most objective way of measuring behaviours, and we're looking at animal and human learning, essentially. So that was the area that they were interested in, because it produced behaviours which could be easily measured, animal and human learning. after the whole behaviourist revolution sort of died down, we got into the 1960s and we got into the cognitive psychologists, and this was again, using lab experiments once again. It's a scientific approach. Cognitive psychology started to infer mental processes, so starting to look a little bit back into consciousness at that point. And then from the 1990s, we've had the biological psychologists that have looked at brain scanning and gene research. So actually psychology moving a bit over into biology really, and taking a bit of its ground, and the other way around, I guess, as well. So you can see how psychology has evolved, hasn't it, really, from a very simplistic introspection type of way of measuring behavior or people's thoughts in that particular case, right through the whole lab study situation there with the behaviorists looking at observable behavior, and into getting a bit more into mental processes and how those mental processes might be connected to other processes, genetic processes, neural correlates, etc. Okay. So in terms of evaluation in this area then, so what are we talking about? So is psychology an objective scientific subject is what we're really saying, isn't it? Yeah, you can get a BSc in psychology. I suppose you could say that. So establishes itself as a scientific discipline by utilising the same experimental techniques as those used in natural sciences. Many might argue that that's to its detriment, mightn't they? Because when you're dealing with people, can a lab study really give you the rich information that the human experience has? Maybe not, but in terms of a positive evaluation point, you could certainly use that. Okay, so psychology as a science, you would say yes, it uses scientific experimental techniques that are used in natural sciences. And just to pick up on what I was saying there, so many branches of psychology do not seek to have objective methods. Now, this is a problem in terms of psychology being treated as a science. So you have humanistic, you have psychodynamic approaches. They use things like case studies, they use diary entries, discursive techniques which look at what people produce in terms of their writing or their speech, interviews, that sort of thing, which are idiographic in nature and would be seen as being less scientific. So therefore, psychology is science. Okay, yeah, in some cases, some parts of psychology are much less scientific than others.